The second one, natives define us, this idea that New Zealand's national identity, at least when it comes to wildlife, is defined mainly by our native species. And sure, we'll accept cows and kiwi fruit and so on and so forth in farmed and horticultural settings, but with the notable exception of introduced game species, which is another story again, we don't generally have much time for the non-native in our wildlife, and certainly not in the conservation estate. But what I would venture is that way of framing our identity is very much a current choice that we're choosing to make. It's not a fact, and it's a choice that we can change over time as well, remembering that in the mid-1800s, New Zealand's colonial people defined themselves largely by introduced species. At that time, they saw introduced species as defining their sense of national identity, and natives essentially as foreigners. So our views since that time have basically reversed. They've gone from one extreme really to the other, with a little pause for thought or consideration in the interim. It's clear we often seem to use wildlife as props for expressing our visions of a puristic national identity. And that identity is currently defined not only by the presence of native species, but also by the absence of many ostensibly foreign species of wildlife. As one of my interviews informed me here, again, another quote, the best conservationists in New Zealand are the best murderers, essentially. That's the guts of it. And the more mustelids or rats or whatever it might be that you can kill, the more effective you're going to be at your job. And that was a former staff member at the Department of Conservation, someone that's still very committed to conservation in New Zealand. A lot of people see their role in New Zealand as compassionate killers, removing the species that don't belong and supporting those that do. And for a lot of people, killing pests really is an important part of expressing their national identity and connecting with the local culture. As anthropologist Nicholas Smith reflected recently when considering conservation in Australia, he said that for many conservationists, getting rid of feral biota and reintroducing native ones is a way of making the country and themselves more Australian. I think that holds even more so for us here in New Zealand. But what I would suggest, an opposite I suppose, is that our wildlife doesn't have to be defined entirely by our native species. That's again a choice that we're currently making. In many other countries, introduced species come to be regarded as important facets of their wildlife and to their sense of national and local identity as well. In many European countries, for example, introduced species are highly treasured features of their wild biota. It's also important to note that identities are not just defined by things, they're also defined by processes and influence as well. A recent survey of people in the Mediterranean islands, for example, found that people there considered the local environment to be characterised in many ways by sustained anthropomorphic change. As the authors of the study summarised, many people thought that the environment of the Mediterranean islands should be allowed to continue to evolve within the changing cultural landscapes as they had for millennia. These sorts of sentiments are expressed not just in the old world, but also in the new world as well. As a quote from Central American ecologist Ariel Lugo, who is said to find it difficult to despise invasive trees, as he thinks many of his colleagues does, and even embraces that change. And he's quoted as saying there, "My parents and their parents saw one Puerto Rico, and I'm going to see another Puerto Rico, and my children will see another." So that sense of change and dynamism in the ecosystem is really reflected there. Taking a few of these sorts of threads in mind, I think there's scope, at least for here in New Zealand, to start to think a little bit more holistically and perhaps a little more inclusively about our sense of national identity and how many of our wild introduced species often contribute to that identity alongside their native counterparts.